But one former cop in St. Louis has decided to write a piece in the Washington Post talking about his experience with the St. Louis Police Department. He talks about how he experienced racism firsthand and how the police force is so fundamentally broken and flawed that he felt the need to leave after working as a police officer for 5 years. So first of all, he kind of shares his experiences dating back to 1994. He says, in 1994, I joined the St. Louis Police Department. I quickly realized how naive I'd been. I was floored by the dysfunctional culture I encountered. So he talked about how when he was growing up in the suburban area of St. Louis, you know, he experienced some harassment from cops and he had a very negative view of cops, but he actually knew someone in his personal life who was a great guy who happened to also be a cop. And that person convinced him to join the police force and try to change it, right? Like join, become a police officer and start changing the system yourself. You know, you could be the person who takes the first step. But he realized after working in the police department that was a naive notion.
That wasn't going to work.
Yeah. So that's what I guess I was saying inarticulately earlier this year in April. We were doing a story about the girl from Occupy Wall Street who was elbowed by a cop, went into seizure, they cuffed her, she was having seizures, and they all stood around and watched. And then she got put to jail, but the cop didn't, right? Mm-hmm. So, and what I say, because I know police, I grew up in a cop culture. Everybody in my neighborhood, half of them were cops, half of them were criminals. My dad was a cop, my grandpa, my 3 best friends were cops, my oldest brother's a cop. So I know cops, mm-hmm. and I know the culture, and the people, it's just like what this guy says. A lot of people do join the police force wanting to make a difference or do something. But either you change, you join their culture, or you quit. It's usually that way. There's very few guys where you end up like Serpico. You become a pariah, right? So that's what I'm talking about. It's the culture that changes them, and they see us as the enemy. We've said it a million times, and that there's a couple guys coming out now. There's another guy in New York who just came out mm-hmm. talking about the how racist the stop and frisk thing was, and all the problems he's seen in it. So they're just now starting to get, but it's a death sentence for these cops to come out and say this. I can't believe that takes more courage than anything.
It does take a lot of courage. Right now, he's working for the NAACP. He's no longer a police official. By the way, his name is Reddit Hudson. And, you know, he gave very specific accounts in his Washington Post piece. Okay, so let me give you some examples. He says, I won't say all, but many of my peers were deeply racist. One example, a couple of officers ran a website called St. Louis Cop Talk, where officers could post about their experience and opinions. At some point during my career, it became so full of racist rants that the site administrator temporarily shut it down. Cops routinely called anyone of color a thug, whether they were the victim or just a bystander.
Yeah, I don't have any, I mean, it just, you know, rings 100% true. I don't know whether it's totally corrupted by this. Like, what happens? Because I think there's a whole third reason why people become cops. Some because they want the power, no question, right? And they can assert it over people, and they're given legal authority to be a dick. And then there's people who think it's a good job and want to make a difference. But left in that, the first part of that is, I think, really operative, the good job part. Like, a lot of guys do it because
my dad.
Yeah, it's a good job, right?
It's a good
job. You get
job.
a pension, you get a paycheck, a regular paycheck, you get time off, you get overtime.
You're never going to get laid off.
Right, you're never going to get laid off no matter how many people you shoot. You know, so it's a good gig. I mean, it is as good as city. And now, in this crazy day and age where the popular governors are supported by people against their interest. Governors who work against people's interest are supported by those people. Scott Walker's still getting support from working men and women while he's trying to crush their public service union. But what does he leave out? Cops. Yeah. Cops get left out of that because you can't touch cops, right? And so they sort of somehow they get the right to bargain publicly, but teachers aren't going to get the right to bargain publicly. So even in this day and age where you got governors hostile to the working man like Scott Walker, everybody leaves cops out. Nobody's going to come down. Nobody's going to crack down on cops' ability
because
to
they want to be viewed as tough on crime. They want to be viewed as supportive of cops. It's kind of the same type of mentality that they have when it comes to supporting the troops. Like, you can't touch the troops. You can never criticize. And you wouldn't want to criticize the troops. It's not them doing anything wrong. It's usually the domestic and foreign policy that leads them to do the things that they have to do. They are how the state exercises its will, right? So they got to have them because that's how we impose our will as legislatures, as our power. It comes through them. So that's why they're always protected. Yeah. So one other account that he mentioned in his piece that I thought was interesting. Once I accompanied an officer on a call at one home. A teenage boy answered the door.
Oh, this is horrible.
The officer accused him of harboring a robbery suspect and demanded that he let her inside. When he refused, the officer yanked him onto the porch by his throat and began punching him. Another officer met us and told the boy to stand. He replied that he couldn't. So the officer slammed him against the house and cuffed him. When the boy again said he couldn't walk, the officer grabbed him by his ankles and dragged him to the car. It turned out the boy had been on crutches when he answered the door and he couldn't walk.
Yeah, well, showed him though.
So that
Next time
sounds
around,
like,
he'll let the cops into his house.
so when you hear Michael Brown's friend say that Darren Wilson pulled up, swore at them, grabbed him by the throat, yanked him, and you know that's exactly what happened. And I knew that's exactly what happened because I know cops. I lived around them. I saw Chris Hayes interviewing the St. Louis Police Union head, that guy who was upset at the Rams.
Right.
And Chris Hayes kept getting his ass kicked by this guy because he couldn't believe that this guy was, yes, Chris doesn't know how to think like a criminal, right? I know how to think like a criminal. I grew up around criminals. I totally can understand their mindset. And that's what, white people who live in a bubble of whiteness can't ever imagine that would happen. They've been treated nicely their whole life. Steve O even said, right, that as an Asian, he gets treated even nicer than white people. They're always friendly to him. And then Steve O, though, had the presence of mind to tweet out that, if you think that police brutality only happens to blacks, you're a fool. They're going to come for you. They came for the trade unionists. I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. They came for the Jews. I didn't say anything.
I mean, if you are even a little politically active, think about the police response to that. I mean, don't even think about Ferguson. Don't even think about the recent news. Think about how Occupy protesters were greeted when they were sitting there in Zuccotti Park. I mean, some of the police brutality that was displayed there, the police brutality that was displayed at UC Davis, where the cop was spraying pepper spray casually as these protesters were literally sitting there doing absolutely nothing. They were not violent, they were not disorderly. So yeah, this goes beyond a race issue. This has to do with excessive force, police brutality toward the population, anyone that has the audacity to question authority.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right. And you know who they didn't pepper spray? You know who they didn't shoot? Cliven Bundy. Isn't that amazing, right? A bunch of white guys show up with assault weapons. All of a sudden, we have a little more respect for you.